Welcome back to part 2 of this 2-part interview with Jean Brown. As promised for this episode, I wanted to share a little more about the Seek Safely organization that was started by the Brown family as a way to guide customers and keep self-help practitioners accountable for their actions through legislation. As the Seek Safely website reads, quote, Kirby Brown's family decided to bring positive purpose to Kirby, James Shore, and Elizabeth Newman's tragic deaths by creating Seek Safely. Kirby's search to find the deeper meaning in life and a deeper purpose for herself was a huge part of who she was. We want to be Kirby's voice to keep others safe from physical, emotional, and financial harm. When someone is seeking to expand themselves, they should not lose their money, their time, or their life. End quote. So this website is an excellent resource for listeners. They have information directed for consumers, for practitioners, and for legislative efforts related to the self-help industry. As a practitioner myself, I have taken the Seek Safely promise, whereby one can agree to abide by certain values, principles, and practices that will be implemented to serve the best interests of those they are working with. I highly recommend this for anyone who considers themselves in the healing fields or wellness industry. The website also contains a resource link where you will find lots of excellent information from self-help fact sheets, with some amazing statistics that might be surprising to some of you. And the Seek Safely podcast is the official voice of the nonprofit organization, which advocates for ethics and accountability in the self-help industry and empowers seekers to have safe and effective self-improvement journeys. Jean Brown and Dr. Glenn Patrick Doyle peel back the layers of the largely unregulated, multi-billion-dollar self-help industry, discussing the patterns of exploitation and deception that pervade the industry and allow self-help gurus to thrive at the expense of their customers and followers. And they state that along the way, they'll have discussions with people who care as much as they do about the self-help industry being held accountable for the promises it makes, and they lay out a vision of a world in which seekers are respected and protected. So please check out all they have to offer. They truly are providing a much-needed gift to the public. And on that note, please join us as we pick back up from our conversation in part 1. And then another reference that I've heard that I think I saw in 2 different places, but again, I don't know that I'm curious about if this came out in the trial. I'm curious if this is kind of out there because it feels like one of those things that's a little like swept under the carpet. Mm-hmm. That I believe there's a report from one of the participants that survived where they were on the floor, but they saw James come out of the tent when he deemed the sweat lodge to be over. Mm-hmm. And that he kind of came out in this triumphant attitude and sort of stance, mm-hmm. like even sort of like raising his arms or something like that. And I wondered, I mean, to me, that is just such a massive disconnect from what's going on. Yeah. And he has been in there with those people. There are people outside who are passed out and throwing up. Mm-hmm. Things are not good. People are not well. And honestly, even if you are, if you're in a totally messed up mental state, all you need is your eyeballs to mm-hmm. know that, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that is especially, I guess what it really is, Jean, it's one of those kind of symbolic moments, mm-hmm. you know? So I'm wondering, is that something that, you've heard from others? Was that just a single report? Do we feel like that was kind of real? I don't know how much you can comment on that, but
Yeah, I think the description of that came from one of his volunteers that was at the event. So to be perfectly honest, I can't remember if it's just her account that describes that moment, or if there were more people who also said that. I'm honestly not sure. A lot of the participants that we know who we've spoken with, they were not in a great state. So their own vision or memory of what had happened in the immediate aftermath was pretty focused on their own experiences.
oh yeah.
But yeah, I think whether it happened exactly that way or not, I think it kind of is representative of how he was running this sweat lodge like it was some physical endurance test. And, he was proud of himself for coming out of it and coming through it. And again, that's one of the things that Native Americans who run legitimate sweat lodges would say. It's never supposed to be presented as this endurance test, because that mindset would have people push beyond their physical limits, which is dangerous. So, that I think that's kind of what we can glean from that.
Yeah. And then, do you mind, Jean, kind of describing, you might be more familiar with this, because I had to kind of piece this together a little bit, that it's my impression that James Ray came out of the tent, was kind of proud of himself. Maybe, and then there's this weird gap for me in kind of what happened. Like, we hear that he then went to his room.
Mm-hmm.
He reports in Enlighten Us that he was in his room. There was a knock on the door, and that's the first time he realizes that, I don't know if it's the first time he realizes that anything's wrong, or that people are extremely unwell, or maybe that that people aren't breathing.
Mm-hmm.
But then his next move is he calls a lawyer. The lawyer advises him to get out of there. And that's kind of this story of him like kind of fleeing the scene.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially he never spoke to anybody or spoke to his people until much later, which I do want to address that a little bit.
Yeah.
But do you have a sense of kind of what the accurate story around what transpired there?
Yeah, pretty much as you describe it is what we understood to have happened. I don't know, to be honest, the exact timeline of, from the time the sweat lodge was over until the time he actually left. But we just heard, he went back to his room, had like a shower and something to eat, and then, eventually spoke with his lawyers who advised him not to talk to the police and just to leave. So that by the time people were kind of gathering after the fact, he was not there. And, there are interviews with some of the participants sort of in the very immediate aftermath where they felt like abandoned, because here he was throughout this week, like guiding them through all of these events and this whole experience, and establishing himself as the authority. And then when they really would have needed him, he was gone. So yeah, I think it kind of added to the trauma that some of the survivors then experienced.
Yes, I can imagine it would. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then there's this interesting information that I believe your mother was kind of the first one to receive. And I believe this was kind of through Beverly, who seemed to play a really important role kind of for you guys and the family.
Mm-hmm.
And Beverly, of course, is it Beverly Bunn?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was one of the participants.
Mm-hmm.
And so she talks about how afterward, at some point, I don't know the timeline around this, but that James Ray had a meeting with everybody that was there. And maybe, do you mind sharing a little bit about that, Jean, what that report?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So, yes, in the aftermath of what had happened, we were trying to speak with participants, so we knew a few of the people who had been there at the Spiritual Warrior because my mother and father had actually gone to James Ray events with Kirby. So they knew a couple of the people, and then also my mom was reaching out to anyone that she knew from any of the James Ray events, even if they hadn't been at the 2009 Spiritual Warrior, just to try to find out if we could gather any information. And so what we heard was the phone call was like a conference call with the participants, and they had a channeler available to talk to the participants. It was kind of like, I guess you could describe it like a spiritual debrief almost. Okay, so we've all gone through this experience. We know that people died. We're trying to process it and figure out what happened. And he has this channeler on who explains that, she had sort of contacted, or she had knowledge of Kirby and James Shore's spirits, because I think at that point when that meeting happened, Liz Newman was actually still in the hospital in a coma, and she had not passed yet. So Kirby and James Shore, their spirits were having so much fun in the afterlife that they decided not to return to their bodies. And so, yeah, we heard that, and it was like, what? And then it was very clearly like, oh, this is so incredibly manipulative. I mean, I guess in some ways you could see it maybe trying to help people deal with some of the shock and grief by putting it in a more positive light. Maybe you could describe it that way, but I think even more so it was just manipulative, trying to diminish the gravity of what had happened, and sort of excuse it, and then also establish this idea that it was a choice that they made, when the reality was that they weren't capable of making a choice for themselves. That was pretty frustrating.
Well, I hope that part of the story is a gift to the public, because these are things that we naturally and easily fall into when we have the mystical realm that can explain something, to allow us to make sense of things that are just unimaginable or inexplicable.
Right.
And this is the area, I would say, again, personal opinion, but this is an area where we see, this is what I call, when we've got churches and religions, religious abuse. When the actual teachings harm.
Right.
Hate. And so in this case, this belief system is really way outside of the scope of reality of what all the families are going through. So that's really harmful and painful to have no validation of what the experience just was. But also, I'd call it a form, again, I don't mean to disrespect people's belief systems. Many of us live in some sort of a belief system that is unprovable, right? But I think it's really important that we recognize and have education around how spiritual principles can be manipulated.
Yes.
To, in this case, kind of remove feelings, first of all, to remove feelings that could come up around grief, guilt, responsibility, And it's kind of it's sort of like an easy spiritual bypass
Yes.
to
Yeah.
go, if I buy into this, then I don't have to feel any of the hard feelings. And I get to rely on the certainty of the story, which as humans, of course, we're always seeking, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think right along with that, one of James Ray's big things one of his big teachings, which was like the main point of The Secret, right, is the whole law of attraction. And that was also part of what was put forth as the explanation for what had happened. And that's one of the reasons that, I think some of the ideas of the law of attraction can be valuable for people, but it can also be a very slippery slope into saying, they died because of something that was wrong in their own thoughts.
Yes.
It can become very victim blaming very quickly. I think one of the other things that the channeler said was that, there was like a karmic element to what had happened where they had harmed James Ray in a past life. And then that's why it was like a karmic balancing that they died in this life. And yeah, it's very manipulative, using spiritual beliefs to excuse bad behavior, basically. Yeah.
Right. And what's so scary about that too is that it's kind of like in the unknown realm, you can make it whatever you want. You can make this story whatever you want. You can make it about karma. You can get that story of the past life stuff.
Right.
It really, I think people who are in those worlds don't necessarily, most of us, again, none of us enter a cult. But most of us don't realize what, as you called it so rightly, that slippery slope, right? We don't realize that it can begin one way and end up very quickly going into something that is excusing, bypassing, or shifting and just shifting a whole reality and story.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and this is one of the things that we try to point out as we, try to educate seekers of self-help and self-improvement. I think open-mindedness is a character strength on the balance, right? I think it's a good thing to have an open mind, to be open to different possibilities, different ideas. But when you put that with a manipulative teacher, it can become a vulnerability. Because here you are ready to receive different ideas and ready to learn, and you're opening yourself up to different possibilities. And then if you have a dangerous teacher, they exploit that to their own ends. So it's like we want to tell people it's good to have an open mind, but you have to recognize that it does leave you a bit vulnerable. And this is a perfect example. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. And I think about, may I enter into sort of using this example of prayer, right? Because even prayer, it's something so common. All religions kind of have this understanding of prayer. But for example, in my group, what happens there, and this is very law of attraction-y, prayer becomes a tool that is a tool to be refined and a tool of power, really. In other words, something, and I say this for our audience because I'm sure when I say prayer, most people think what we all think, right? A personal, quiet, internal experience between you and creator, or whatever that, or you and universe, whatever that, looks like. But in these groups, often also prayer gets used in the exact way that you just described, Jean, where prayer and having your prayer manifest is a direct representation of your own internal clarity and alignment with whatever that prayer is.
Right.
That one teaching alone then puts the onus on the one who is in prayer, where they're either doing it right or wrong, essentially.
Right.
And whatever is manifesting is a direct cause of where you're at in your heart and mind, your actions, your behavior, what have you.
Right.
And that how quick did that slippery slope just happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it can just go right there. And now you think that you're getting more clear, that you have a leader who's helping to teach you how to get more clear about prayer, how to change your life in a positive way. But what's actually happened is you now are put in a bind where you are responsible fully for every single thing in your life or that happens to you. And that is just bullshit.
Yeah.
I mean, natural disasters happen and we didn't create that. My mom passed. I didn't create that.
Right.
I mean, the explanations that kind of come around that can be infused into this.
Right.
And again, you know, I think it's so important in terms of the spiritual world, symbology, prayer. Again, those are things that are personal. So I believe, again, my personal opinion, that was something that we are meant to, if we decide that that's something that's part of our belief system and we want to be with, then that's a personal relationship and evolution that happens, that the one who's having the experience gets to move and be in. And in doing that, we experience the most natural way that we move with those elements, whatever they are, energy or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And that's the way that's supposed to evolve and manifest. It's something that moves naturally in the individual and is discoverable by the individual, not something that somebody else should be telling you. Or even like, again, that's why I mentioned symbology. It's sort of like to have anybody dictating that something, you know, I saw a bird and it landed here. And then the teacher or somebody outside of you dictates what that symbology means. I mean, it just, I believe that again very quickly goes in a very dangerous direction, because the truth is we all have that inside of ourselves, and paying attention to that kind of stuff is also a building of a personal relationship with one, to either oneself, to a larger power or creation, to nature, whatever it is. But that's a personal thing, that experience that reveals and evolves. And so it matters way more that we tune in and feel into, what did that little birdie landing, what did that mean to me?
Right.
Versus anybody else outside of me being able to understand what the meaning of that is.
Yeah, totally.
So sorry, I go off, Jean.
No, that's okay. It brings up another point that we, often try to encourage seekers to kind of hold as they're undertaking any journey of self-improvement or self-discovery or whatever it is. Ultimately, you can have a teacher who guides you through things, and that can be helpful and valuable to you. But the experience that you have, you're really the one who is in charge of it. And you should take that credit for yourself. When you have a profound moment, or, you come to a deeper understanding, sure, somebody may have helped prompt you to get there, but ultimately it's you who is giving that gift to yourself. And I think I would like to see more people kind of own that. And that is a way also, like we were saying earlier, even in sort of problematic circumstances or with problematic teachers, people can still have profound experiences. And that's because of themselves. That's right. The teacher maybe can be a catalyst, but ultimately I think people should feel free to own their own progress and experiences. So, yeah.
Right. That's such a great point, Jean. Yeah. Right. It's so interesting because it's a good touch point to go, one, like, you need to be in control of that experience and exploration. Because in the unhealthy dynamic, there is always a too heavy influence from the leader.
Yeah.
And in other forms that takes place as like interpretations of spiritual text, right? The word of this spiritual text versus the individual. But again, that's typically a group mind latching on to a particular meaning versus one's independent experience with a text, where you're, taking the beauty or the sacred of what you need in whatever moment of time you're in.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yes. So, well, thank you for kind of taking that deep dive. And I know that you and your family have so beautifully journeyed this experience that, you have spoken a lot about it, but I also just want to honor that, that there is something you have given to us in, your willingness to just revisit these things. And Jean, I feel so grateful for your voice and certainly for your mother's, like, on this planet now, because it really is in your willingness to revisit and share and go through like what we just experienced together that others might learn, right? And I really think it's these little nuggets, it's these stories that can ground us into actually seeing some of these tactics and dynamics. Because otherwise, how do you really get it?
Totally. No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it and to share these details because, like we said, there's a lot to it. It's a story with a lot of different angles and a lot of details. And yeah, it's hard to get a full picture of what really happened without getting all of the details. So, yeah, I appreciate it very much, the opportunity to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jean, if you don't mind, well, first of all, is there anything else that you might want to say kind of about the event itself or the circumstances or your experience or your family's experience kind of post or around?
I think we covered it pretty well. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, there was something that you wrote that is kind of on this topic of forgiveness. And I wondered if you'd mind me reading it.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I thought also just this one line that's in a paragraph, a couple of paragraphs ahead, but I just wanted to read this as well in terms of people kind of appreciating the impact of all of this. And you say, there's an endlessness to this pain because James Ray has continued to operate in the self-improvement, self-help world. And I'll just leave it there. But I think, I wanted to kind of honor that statement as you and I have had this conversation. And I feel like this is why we talk about what we talked about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. People bring up words like phrases like moving on or something like that. And it's like, well, it's hard to move on when the cause of our grief is still operating. And I think, one of the reasons that we created an entire nonprofit organization around mostly, self-help consumer education is that it's not just James Ray. This was a very egregious, very extreme example of what can go wrong with an irresponsible teacher. But what we learned really was that there are so many other people that are operating in this way, both with things that are strictly self-help and then with things that definitely veer off into full-on cult territory. The tactics and the manipulation, though, are pretty much the same. So we hope that we can kind of help influence people's understanding in all the circumstances, like all the kind of spectrum of circumstances. But yeah, it's not just James Ray. We quickly learned that it was throughout the whole industry. The industry has no regulation. There's no professional organization to kind of regulate it from within. And it really leaves people open to being harmed by irresponsible or fully manipulative teachers.
Yeah, so I'm so grateful for the Seek nonprofit mission. And of course, for our audience to know that you can check that out. We'll have the link in the show notes here. And Jean, maybe you can share a little bit about the opportunities there for people, but I would like to encourage people to at the very least, look at the site to really understand kind of these bullet point kind of requirements that you have so thoughtfully, put in this format where one can literally just kind of read, oh, this is what's healthy, this is what's unhealthy, to just...
Yeah.
So for anybody doing anything self-helpy at all, or being in any environment really where there's a natural imbalance of power dynamic, for example, I'm doing clinical work with survivors, but I signed the Seek Safely
the promise.
Promise, because I want it to be known that I stand behind those things and uphold them. And I'd also like other people to know about it and be able to have that as a reference if you're kind of thinking about, jumping into some group environment.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, our mission is kind of threefold. We always say we aim to educate seekers of self-help, and then we also try to bring about a bit of change in the industry itself. So that's where the promise comes in, inviting providers in this industry to become more active in trying to operate more ethically. And then the third kind of prong of our approach is also trying to maybe build a bit of legislation from without. So we have some legislation pending in New York State that, again, is like a consumer self-help consumer protection. We created on our website under the consumer section, you can see a number of the red flags, like you're saying. And then under the provider section, it is the tenets of the Seek Safely promise and the opportunity to sign it. And with both of those, I think, our ultimate message is pretty simple. Like we were saying before, I think if you know that you're undertaking this kind of work, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable situation. So it's just a matter of asking some simple questions about what is going on and how the teacher is operating to determine if they really have your best interest at heart, and ultimately just following your gut, And there are some simple things to do. Like if a teacher is unwilling to answer questions or they become defensive, that's a big red flag. You should be able to ask them things like, why are you qualified to talk to me about my trauma? And they should be able to answer that question without being personally offended. Yes. Right? So these are the kinds of the kind of tools that we try to give people to protect them when they're undergoing this kind of work, because we feel like seeking is very valid. It's like human, to ask questions, to try to find more meaning, to try to improve yourself or become the best version of yourself, to be open to evolving. Like, this is great. This is all beautiful and wonderful. And we don't want to discourage people from doing that outright. We just, don't want people to die when they're doing it, or, to be harmed emotionally or to be taken advantage of financially. The possibilities for abuse are big and varied, and we don't want people to be, taken advantage of.
Yeah. 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 It's such important work, and so important to be bringing awareness around these topics. Jean, I'm curious, do you mind saying a little bit more about the New York legislative work? Because I was curious about that. I was taking a look at it.
Sure. Yeah.
We can support that.
Yeah. So if you go on our website, it's under the legislative tab, you can find more information. But ultimately, we've been working for a number of years. Legislation moves pretty slowly. It can be frustrating sometimes, but it's ultimately trying to require people who are doing this kind of self-improvement work and who are not licensed by the Department of State in a different way. So It won't capture people like, social workers or therapists who have some other kind of licensing. It's people who are practicing without some kind of license. It requires them to register with the state and then provide a number of things to their customers. So, like, they should be able to provide a risk management plan to their customers and to clearly state what the potential risks are. It requires them to tell the customers, what exactly the activities are that they're going to be undertaking. And then again, to have a plan in the event that something goes wrong, because one of the things we saw after the sweat lodge was that people were going through this very difficult physical experience, and there was no plan in case something went wrong. Whereas like if you go to a little league game, there's usually like an ambulance there just in case something happens, right? It requires people to have that kind of preparation.
Yes.
And then also for the mental and emotional harm that could be caused as well, to have some recourse there in case people are struggling that way. So so again, people can go to the website and there are links so that you can read the bill itself and find out more about it. And then so the legislature is not in session right now. They'll be back in session in January. So we are very hopeful that this year they'll actually get to vote on it. It's been for the last few years with the Consumer Protection Committee. And it's gone through some changes and different iterations. So once it gets to the point of actually being voted on, then that's the point where we'll be asking people from everywhere, but especially people from New York State, just to contact their legislators and ask them to support the bill. So
good. Okay. Yeah. So that's probably when we can jump in and do some
help. Yeah. But I think also just like this is helpful. Having the opportunity to talk about this, to just help create more collective understanding of what's going on in this industry and where the potential for harm is. I think that is also helpful, just to where we get to the point where legislators are actually looking at it to vote on, being able to have that deeper understanding.
Yeah. And Jean, is there anything else you'd like us to know about? Perhaps the podcast?
Yeah. with Seek Safely, like I said, we have a number of different things that we've been doing to try to, get our message out there. So we just started our own podcast, and it's called Seek Safely, and it's on, all the main platforms. And we just did our first interview with someone else, and yeah, it's just based around, again, this idea of consumer education, trying to talk about the problems within the industry without discouraging people from seeking, Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's so important. And it's an interesting, I encounter this as well, where it's sort of this interesting line, where you hope that in the advocacy for safety, we can also hold the value that people want and need, as you said, meaning, spirituality, these types of things, growth.
Yeah.
And that there are spaces where both of these considerations can exist together, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's it.
So if you don't mind, Jean, I would love to read a little excerpt from the book.
Sure.
And this part was around forgiveness, but I also want to just share with the audience that this book is really so powerful, and there will be a link to it in the notes. It's called This Sweet Life, How We Lived After Kirby Died. And it is so beautifully written. It's so intimate. Like, there really was, for me, Jean, I shared with you that I so felt Kirby in it, but also I so felt this kind of legacy of your family, kind of her being a part also of this body of, and even ancestral, like how some of her words are woven in here. And she really, right. I think it was one of her comments going into the sweat lodge of like, our ancestors are with us.
Yeah.
Throughout the book, I really felt that, just you all even bringing in a little bit of your travel and the journey to Scotland that happened after the trial, and just really feeling this legacy and connection and history that at its core has this like incredibly alive and beautiful life and spirit. And I kind of feel that through you all as kind of this body somehow.
Right. That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is on page 299. And it is your question, Jean. So, have I forgiven James Ray? To be honest, I'm not completely sure, and I allow myself to not fully answer that question. Forgiving someone who's wronged me in such a profound way may be an unrealistic expectation, but here's what I've come to at this point. If forgiveness is simply a process of allowing that a person can continue to exist after the transgression, then I have forgiven James Ray. He served his time, and I respect that. I don't wish him harm or a horrible existence. I'm confident that if he is a feeling person, the burden of his actions will weigh on him forever, no matter what he says. But if forgiveness is about never again feeling the anger, the hurt, even the rage that emerges about what happened to Kirby, then no, I am not there. And part of that, I know, is because James Ray continues and does not assume meaningful responsibility. He claims to take responsibility, but I don't accept that while he continues working in the self-improvement field, if he had truly taken responsibility, he would recognize how profoundly he failed as a teacher. He was so profound a failure that his students died, 4 of them. Obviously, he was doing something so wrong, he should understand he is unqualified for this work. Instead, he continues without bothering to learn more or gain more skills as a coach, teacher, guru, speaker that would ensure he won't endanger the physical or emotional health of future customers. It would be easier to let James Ray be if he found a new line of work, sales, real estate, maybe. And what's more is that rather than claiming this sort of meaningful responsibility, he instead claims the pain of those losses of life as his own. He claims the tragedy is something that happened to him rather than something he orchestrated. When I think about that, I'm angry, absolutely. What I see now is that, like grief, forgiveness is not a one-time deal. It's not a transaction to conduct and complete like buying a car and driving off the lot. It's a continual effort, something we must confront again and again, every time the pain resurfaces. Every time I see James Ray holding another event, another speaking engagement, discussing a forthcoming book, every time I have to face this question of forgiveness again. But for me, that is where I come back to Kirby. It's not about Ray exactly. It's about accepting my own level of responsibility to hold James Ray accountable where he has not held himself accountable. If he will continue with this delusion of his important work that he must guide and teach people while disregarding their emotional and physical safety, I will continue to challenge that because Kirby would. And because I don't want another person like Kirby to die. I'm not an angry person. I'm not obsessed with James Ray or his activities. But we are forever connected now, and his actions tend to follow me. When I come across information about his activities in the self-help industry, it brings back feelings, maybe anger. I am okay with that, though, because even anger is an emotion that points to the need for something to be done. Something needs to change. It can't all just continue as it did before Kirby died. So I hope that was okay to read all of that.
Yeah.
It's so moving for me because I think it expresses many layers of your experience, the feelings, the continual reliving, the impact, and also his mentality, and that continues to affect because whatever element for him, well, let's just call it what it is. The lack of responsibility that he has taken also has this resonant impact. And we don't know what the impact is, maybe moving forward as he now has followers.
Right. Yeah. That's it. You know, we like, especially as an organization, we don't want to talk about James Ray all the time, right? Because like I said, it's bigger than him. The problem is bigger than him. I mean, this is an industry that enabled somebody like him to do what he did, right? But like you read there in that passage, it's inevitable that it always does come up. And, you know, he kind of just stands as a prime example of what's wrong in the industry. So, yeah, that's just part of, you know, what we have to continue dealing with is kind of answering these questions about him and about Sedona. Yeah, what happened.
Yeah, and we just kind of, again, in honor of survivors, I realized, Jean, when I read that you gave that acknowledgement of 4 having died.
Yeah.
And this we didn't address for the audience, just that there was a woman, Colleen Conaway,
Mm-hmm.
who also died by suicide
Mm-hmm.
at one of his events. I don't know if you
Yeah.
say anything about that, but
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was an event in July 2009, where Spiritual Warrior was October 2009. And yeah, as far as what we understand happened, she was clearly in some kind of emotional turmoil, and she took her own life during the event. And, her family has said, like, they had no reason to believe she was in that kind of danger when she went to the event. So that was concerning. And then the way that Ray and his team around him responded was also concerning, in that they didn't tell other participants what had happened. They said that she just left. They didn't really reach out to her family to explain what had happened, and they didn't do any kind of self-reflection. What caused this to happen to somebody who was at their event? What could they do differently? Nobody pushed her, right? She did, at a point, she made a choice, but there were things that led her to that choice from what she had experienced at the event. And again, I think if that happens, you have to look at what did we do that might have caused this? What could we do differently in the future? And they didn't do any of that. They just really covered it up. And then, so we felt like, had there been that kind of taking responsibility at that point, the Spiritual Warrior event maybe would never have happened. So...
oh, it's so intense.
yeah.
And, you bring in like the other element that I want to just mention there, and you touched on this of kind of even just in the voice of her family, assuming that she wasn't entering in a severely disturbed state or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Things tend to get addressed, seen either in documentaries, publicly through the media, or in courts when there is a crime,
Mm-hmm.
let's say. But actually, leading up in this industry, leading up and as a standalone,
Mm-hmm.
it's truly the mental, psychological manipulation
Yeah.
that alone harms people.
Right.
When we see it leading to criminal activity or to death, that's an escalation,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's also just so important, and this is sort of a big sort of drive of mine, and sort of mission is really around people understanding those psychologically manipulative tactics and the coercive control, and also the power of influence and the power of group dynamics. It's like, if we understand those things, we help protect people.
Mm-hmm.
But those things alone also really harm and really mess people up. I mean, really, as you state so clearly, Jean, really make people vulnerable.
Yeah.
It happens quickly and you don't realize it. We talk all the time about how it's like, if you have not been educated on these principles, nobody joins a cult. You join something that you think is super cool, you get in there, and then it's the frog in boiling water experience. Where the next thing you know, you cannot get out and you're drowning and you die potentially, in spirit or to yourself, in a not good spiritual way, right? You've actually dissociated from who you are, and you've given your power and your world for another individual to dictate. And it's incredible. I mean, this is why society can't believe it and they don't understand, right? Because they look at these people, every single person who was in that documentary is a participant, every person was on that stand is a participant. You look at these people and they are smart, beautiful, vibrant people, really achievers in society. They are not what kind of society imagines of like stupid people getting cults.
Right.
So I appreciate that your work, also debunks those myths about individuals and helps to bring awareness to these really kind of insidious elements that are hard to see, right? That we can't call or label as criminal, but the internal experience is complete entrapment and dissociation from oneself, right?
Yeah.
That is criminal, actually.
Yeah.
And thank goodness in certain states under more kind of domestic violence laws, those principles are being worked into law, which again, to things that we've talked about, I mean, if those don't stand alone to, as kind of activities that we can hold people accountable for and be punished for, at least that knowledge infuses into the system that, for example, the judge who sat at that case would have at least had that understanding of those elements going on, which is truly what he was missing,
Yeah, no, we wonder about that because as we see, like you're saying, these coercive control, particularly in domestic situations, legislation is being passed in different places. I think it already was passed in England. And then I think there are a few states now in the US that are like California, I think. I don't know if it's been passed or it's pending. But yeah, I think our legal system is finally catching up to that understanding. And had some of those laws existed in 2009, it may have changed the trial,
Because
like
actually,
that understanding that people would bring to the table.
Yeah, right. And it is interesting actually to think about your guys' timeline because it was in the UK that those laws have been passed, and that was actually under the Serious Crimes Act of 2015. But that was the first time that any of this has been written into any law.
Right.
And now in the US, you're right. In California, New York, and I think Hawaii, Connecticut, and I don't think all of those 4 states' legislation is completely solidified. And also, of course, there are different weights to some of this stuff too. This is all very kind of new to me, this legal world, world of laws and such. But I also do understand from the little experience that I'm now having in some advocacy work that, Jean, if you can pass this legislation in New York, what I've kind of heard from, my people that do the advocacy work in these areas is if you can pass the legislation in New York, then it's much easier to get it passed in these other states, that it's kind of this first one is the real struggle and the real difficult thing.
Yeah. That's the advice that we were given as well, because we were like, we want like a federal law. And the people we spoke with were like, well, it doesn't really work that way. It's usually like you've got to get it passed in one state. And then it tends to be, or like you hope that it will be kind of a cascading like domino effect where it gets passed in one place and then other states have a template to look at. They don't have to go through like, we've gone through the whole process in New York with the legislators that we've been working with of drafting the bill and trying to create language around this and create, all of these parameters. And so once it's passed, other states can look at that and say, okay, good, we're just going to replicate this basically.
Yeah.
That's
good. Well, I'm assuming that for our audience, following the work that you all are doing, then we'll know about kind of when that gets passed and hopefully bringing it, to some other states. And surely you and I will be in touch, but I would love to be helpful in whatever way I can.
Yeah, thank you.
California legislation. So, Well, Jean, is there anything else kind of that you would like to share or say?
Oh, I don't think so.
We covered a lot.
Yeah, this has been awesome, actually. So comprehensive, and no, I think we pretty much got everything. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your participation and your time and your voice and your heart. It's just, I feel very, very grateful, and really feel Kirby's spirit living on kind of through all of you and this work,
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate it. And I'm grateful for what you're doing as well. Like I said, we feel like things are changing, like more people are kind of coming to understand, what is going on. And you sharing your story and sharing your knowledge and insights is part of that. And it makes us feel less alone, and we're so grateful. Yeah.
I really understand that. We so hope that you enjoyed this episode. These podcasts were edited by Nathan Lemke. If you'd like to work with him, please reach out to me and I will put him in touch with you. And please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the season 2 song written by Jaya Suri. And for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out the show notes.